Claire Scott stood in the marble lobby of a 40-story building on the Gold Coast, a security guard's hand wrapped around her arm, the rooftop party glittering behind the glass doors like a world she was never supposed to touch. The crowd inside didn't notice. The music kept playing. The champagne kept flowing. She didn't cry. She didn't pull away. She just pressed her lips together, dropped her gaze to the floor, and let him walk her out. She was wearing a faded pink hoodie, the only thing she owned that still felt like hers. What Claire didn't know was that the man who owned every floor of that building was standing 30 feet away, watching her leave. Not watching the party. Not watching the door. Watching her. And before this night is over, Claire Scott is going to discover something that changes everything. The difference between a room that tolerates you and a man who actually sees you. But to understand why one of the most dangerous men in Chicago would track down a nursing student he'd never spoken to, we need to go back. Back to the night Claire made a decision that cost her nothing and unknowingly changed both their lives forever. If this story is for you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Because this one is for every girl who kept her chin up on the way out the door, even when no one was watching. Claire didn't grow up believing doors would open for her. She grew up learning how to pick the lock herself. She was 22 years old, a second-year nursing student at DePaul University, Southside born and raised, the kind of girl who scheduled her study sessions around diner shifts and wrote papers on a cracked laptop between the lunch rush and dinner service. She had a partial scholarship that covered 60% of her tuition and a gap that covered nothing, the kind of gap that turns into a second job, a third alarm, a skip meal on a Tuesday because the light bill came due. She didn't have a safety net. She had discipline and she had a plan, and she held both of them like they were the only things between her and the version of her life that wasn't supposed to be temporary. 3 weeks ago, her classmate Priya had texted her about a charity gala at the Meridian Tower. It'll be good for networking. Just come. You can borrow something to wear. Claire had said no twice. Then she said yes because Priya said the hospital's chief of nursing would be there, and Claire needed a clinical placement for the spring semester, and she was running out of options. She didn't borrow anything to wear. She showed up in what she had. She lasted 20 minutes. The security guard didn't ask her name. Didn't ask who invited her. He looked at her once. Hoodie, braids, light blue jeans, looked at the crowd behind her, and made a decision in under 3 seconds. His hand found her arm before she could finish her drink. "Miss, I'm going to need you to come with me." She didn't argue. She didn't make a scene. She pressed her lips together, dropped her gaze to the polished marble floor, and walked out with her dignity assembled around her like armor, the kind you build after years of being told, in ways large and small, that certain rooms were never built for you. She didn't see him on her way out, but he saw her. He was standing near the far window, 30 feet from the door, hands relaxed at his sides, black tailored suit, white shirt, black hair slicked back with the kind of precision that costs money without announcing it. He wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't holding a drink. The party moved around him like water around stone, and he stood completely still, because Lee Young-cho had been to 100 parties in this building and had been bored by every single one of them, until now. His eyes didn't move from the door long after she was gone. Claire had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not by choice, by arithmetic. The breakfast shift at Lena's diner started at 5, which meant leaving her apartment on the south side by 4:30, which meant the alarm went off at 4 and there was no such thing as snoozing it because she had exactly 11 minutes to wash her face, pull her braids back, and get out the door before the first bus came. She had missed that bus once in October, and spent the next 2 weeks eating instant oatmeal for dinner to cover the lift she'd had to take instead. That was the kind of math her life ran on. Every decision had a cost. Every cost had a consequence. There was no buffer, no cushion, no number to call if something went wrong. There was just Claire, the alarm, and the bus. The breakfast shift ran until noon. Then she came home, changed her uniform shirt, and went back for the dinner prep shift from 2 to 6. She did this 4 days a week. On the other 3, she was in class or in the library or at the kitchen table in her studio apartment with her nursing textbook spread open under a lamp she bought at a garage sale for $3 because the overhead light had stopped working in September and her landlord stopped answering calls around the same time. This was her life. Not a rough patch. Not a temporary situation she was passing through on her way to something easier. This was the architecture of it, built shift by shift, loan payment by loan payment, the partial scholarship covering 60% of her DePaul tuition and the remaining 40% sitting on a repayment plan she tried not to think about too hard after 10 at night. Her mother called on the 1st of every month. Not to check in. To check the balance. Baby, I'm a little short this month, just $200. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. And Claire, who had $47 left in her checking account and a student loan interest notice sitting unopened on her counter, would say she'd see what she could do. Because that's what she'd always done. Because somewhere along the way she had become the responsible one without anyone asking her permission, and the role had calcified around her so completely she'd stopped noticing it was a cage. Priya had texted her about the gala on a Wednesday. There's this charity event at the Meridian Tower on Saturday. Gold Coast. Black tie kind of. You should come. The chief of nursing at Northwestern Memorial is supposed to be there. Could be good for your clinical placement. I can put your name on the list. Claire had typed no and deleted it. Typed maybe and deleted that too. Then she looked at the email from DePaul's clinical placement office she'd been avoiding for 3 days. The one explaining that her spring placement was still unconfirmed, that spots were limited, that students were encouraged to make use of professional networking opportunities wherever possible. She texted Priya back. What time? She finished her dinner shift at 6:15 on Saturday, untied her apron, and went to the gas station bathroom 2 blocks from the diner to change. She brought her clothes in a plastic grocery bag. Light blue jeans, her faded pink hoodie, the white sneakers she'd cleaned with a toothbrush the night before. She stood in front of the gas station mirror under the fluorescent light and did what she could. Smoothed her braids. Pressed her lips together. Looked at herself for a long moment. She knew it wasn't enough for the room. She knew that before she even left. But knowing something and letting it stop you are 2 different decisions, and Claire Scott had never been very good at letting things stop her. The L train to the Gold Coast took 40 minutes. She stood the whole way, bag on her shoulder, watching the neighborhoods change outside the window, the south side giving way to the loop, giving way to the kind of clean, wide sidewalks and glass towers where people didn't check their bank balance before ordering dinner. The Meridian Tower had a canopy out front, and a doorman and an elevator bank that opened directly onto the rooftop terrace. Priya had texted the floor number. Claire rode up alone. She heard the party before the doors opened. Music, laughter. The specific high-pitched clink of expensive glasses touched together in celebration of something. Then the doors opened and it was all of it at once. The women in red and black gowns, the men in fitted suits, the waitstaff moving through the crowd with trays of champagne. The city spread out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows like a painting hung specifically to impress. Nobody looked at her when she walked in. Then one person did. Then another. She found a spot near the edge of the room and stood there. Holding a glass of water a waiter had handed her almost out of pity, scanning the crowd for Priya, who was not answering her texts. She waited. She kept her expression neutral. She was good at neutral. She had been there for 19 minutes when the security guard appeared at her elbow. He was large, bearded, wearing a black jacket with an earpiece she hadn't noticed from across the room. He didn't introduce himself. He looked at her the way people look at something that's been left in the wrong place. Miss, I'm going to need you to come with me. Not a question. Not an explanation. Just a hand on her arm, firm and unhurried. And the walk toward the elevator that she already knew was coming before he said a word. She didn't pull away. She didn't make a scene. She didn't give him or anyone else in that room the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She pressed her lips together, dropped her gaze to the marble floor and walked. Chin up. Shoulders back. Every step controlled. The elevator doors closed behind her. She rode down alone, the same way she'd come up. Lee Young-cho had not wanted to come to the party. He had made that clear to his assistant, Min Jae, on Thursday morning when the reminder appeared on his calendar with the event details and the guest list attached. Min Jae had explained, patiently, the way he always explained things to a man who already knew the answer, that the Meridian Tower's rooftop terrace had been booked for the evening by a charity foundation whose board included 3 city aldermen, a federal judge, and the deputy commissioner of the Chicago Department of Planning and Development. The foundation was not important. The people on the board were. And Lee Young-cho had 3 rezoning applications currently sitting in the city's review queue, 2 of which had been sitting there for 8 months longer than they should have done so. He stood near the far window for most of the evening, close enough to the room to be visible, far enough from the crowd to avoid being pulled into conversations he had no interest in having. He had a glass of whiskey he'd barely touched. He watched the aldermen work the room, the handshakes, the shoulder touches, the practiced laughter, and felt the particular boredom that comes not from having nothing to do but from having seen everything already. This was the part of his life that looked the most normal from the outside and felt the most hollow from the inside. The parties, the suits, the real estate portfolio that stretched across 14 city blocks and was growing. The Meridian Tower alone was worth $340 million. He owned it through a holding company registered in Delaware that traced back to a second company in Nevada that traced back to nothing anyone could find without knowing exactly where to look. That was by design. Everything in Lee Young-cho's world was by design. He had come to Chicago from Seoul by way of Los Angeles, arriving at 19 with his uncle's phone number, $200, and a working understanding that the only difference between the people who made rules and the people who lived under them was the willingness to build something the rules hadn't accounted for yet. His uncle ran a mid-level import operation out of Koreatown that was legitimate on paper and profitable in ways that didn't appear on any tax filing. Lee Young-cho spent 4 years learning the structure of it, not just the money but the relationships, the leverage, the specific way that fear and loyalty operated when they were properly maintained. Then he left his uncle's organization, took 3 key contacts with him, and built something larger and considerably more difficult to dismantle. BY28. He controlled a network that moved through Chicago's Fulton Market and River North districts like a current beneath the surface, invisible to most, essential to the people who knew it was there. Real estate was how he cleaned it and how he grew it and eventually how it became something that stood on its own. The criminal infrastructure still existed. He didn't pretend otherwise, at least not to himself, but the buildings were real. The developments were real. The 40-story tower he was standing in was real, and it had his name on exactly none of the paperwork and his fingerprints on every inch of it. He was 33 years old. He was, by almost any measure, untouchable. He was also profoundly, chronically bored by rooms full of people performing power they hadn't actually earned. He had been watching the door for no particular reason, the habit of a man who always knows where the exits are, when she walked in. The pink hoodie registered first because it was the only thing in the room not trying to be something it wasn't. Then her face. The braids pulled back clean and practical. The careful, composed expression of someone who had already done the math on how this evening might go and had decided to show up anyway. She moved to the edge of the room and stood there with a glass of water, scanning the crowd, not performing ease she didn't feel but not flinching from the room either. He watched her for 11 minutes before the security guard appeared. He recognized the guard, Marcus, 3rd year with the contracted firm his property manager used for events. He watched Marcus cross the room, watched the hand go to her arm, watched the walk toward the elevator begin. And he did nothing. Not because he didn't register what was happening. He registered it completely. But something in the way she moved stopped him from intervening before he could decide to. The way she pressed her lips together without making a sound, the way her chin came up slightly, the way she didn't look around the room to see who was watching. She already knew people were watching. She had decided it didn't matter. That decision, made in real time under that specific kind of humiliation, was the most composed thing he'd seen anyone do in years. The elevator doors closed. Lee Young-cho set his whiskey glass on the window ledge and looked at the space where she'd been standing for a moment. Then he took out his phone and texted Min-jae 2 words. "Come find me." The next morning, Min-jae placed a single printed page on his desk. A name. A photo pulled from DePaul's public nursing program directory. An address in the South Side. A financial profile assembled from public records, partial scholarship, student loan filings, a diner in the West Loop listed as an employer on a work-study exemption form. Lee Young-cho read it twice. Set it down. Picked it up again and 15 years of building an organization structured entirely around the premise that everyone was afraid of something. He had just encountered a girl with a cracked laptop existence and $40 to her name who had walked out of a room that humiliated her looking like she pitied the room. He told Min-jae to find out everything. 3 weeks after the gala, Claire got a voicemail from Professor Aldridge asking her to come by his office at 2 o'clock on a Thursday. His tone was neutral in the way that isn't actually neutral, careful, measured, the kind of voice people use when they already know something uncomfortable is coming and have decided to let the other person find out in person. Claire listened to it twice on her break at the diner, standing in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the supply closet with a dish towel still over her shoulder. She couldn't identify what was wrong from the message alone, but something in her stomach identified it anyway. She finished her shift, changed out of her uniform in the back, and took the bus to campus. Professor Aldridge taught the health systems and society seminar she shared with 11 other second-year nursing students. Priya among them. It was a writing-heavy course, 3 papers across the semester, each one requiring independent research and a documented argument. Claire had submitted her second paper 10 days ago. She had written it over 2 consecutive evenings at the diner, laptop open on the prep counter after closing, the overhead lights half dimmed, a cooling cup of coffee she kept forgetting to drink beside the keyboard. The screen had a crack running diagonally from the top right corner that split the document view slightly, but didn't affect the text. She had finished it at 11:40 on a Tuesday and submitted it from the diner's Wi-Fi before she locked up and walked to the bus stop. Professor Aldridge's office was on the 3rd floor of the nursing building. He was a thin man in his 50s with reading glasses. He wore on a cord around his neck, and the particular energy of someone who had delivered bad news often enough to have developed a procedure for it. He gestured to the chair across from his desk when she came in. He waited until she sat before he spoke. A concern had been raised, he told her, regarding her most recent paper. A fellow student had filed a formal plagiarism complaint with the department, citing structural and substantive similarities between Claire's submission and a body of published academic work that Claire had not cited in her bibliography. The complaint had been forwarded to the Office of Academic Integrity. There would be a disciplinary review. She would receive the formal notice by email within 48 hours. He said all of it in the same careful, measured tone from the voicemail. When he finished, he folded his hands on his desk and looked at her over the top of his glasses in a way that might have been sympathy or might have been the performance of it. Claire couldn't tell and didn't have the bandwidth to figure it out. She asked who had filed the complaint. He said he wasn't at liberty to share that during the preliminary stage. She asked what sources the complaint cited as the basis for the similarity claim. He slid a single printed page across the desk, 3 academic articles, all published in the last 4 years, none of which Claire had read. She looked at the titles. She looked at the author names. She had never encountered any of them. She thanked him, picked up her bag and left. She knew it was Priya before she reached the stairwell. Not because she had proof. Because she understood, in the specific way you understand things that have been building beneath the surface for months, that Priya had been watching her the way certain people watch someone they've decided to underestimate, waiting for the moment the underestimation stopped being comfortable. Claire had scored 4 points higher than Priya on the first paper. She knew this because Priya had asked casually, in the way that isn't actually casual, what Claire had gotten when grades came back. Claire had told her. Priya had smiled and said good for you in a tone that said something else entirely. The complaint was fabricated. Claire knew this the way she knew her own handwriting, her own work schedule, her own cracked laptop screen at 11:40 on a Tuesday. She had written that paper herself in a diner between service shifts, from sources she had found and read and cited correctly. She had not plagiarized anything. But that almost didn't matter, because the disciplinary review process didn't begin with innocence. It began with a complaint, and the complaint was now in the system, attached to her name, sitting in a file in the Office of Academic Integrity alongside her scholarship information. That if found it plagiarism violation would revoke her scholarship immediately. No scholarship meant no tuition. No tuition meant no enrollment. No enrollment meant no degree, no nursing boards, no clinical placement, no Northwestern Memorial, no any of it. The entire architecture of the life she was building, shift by shift, paper by paper, 4 a.m. alarm by 4 a.m. alarm, rested on that scholarship the way a building rests on its foundation. Remove it and everything above it came down. She took the bus home. She unlocked her apartment, dropped her bag by the door, and sat on the edge of her bed in her coat because she hadn't thought to take it off. The overhead light still didn't work. The lamp from the garage sale threw a small yellow circle on the wall beside the desk where her textbooks were stacked in the order she needed them. Her phone had 2 notifications, a promotional email from the student loan servicer and a text from her mother asking if she could do $150 by Friday. Claire read both of them and set the phone face down on the mattress. For the first time in longer than she could measure, she sat in the quiet of her apartment and did not know what her next move was. Not because she had given up, but because every system she had built for surviving was designed for obstacles she could outwork. And she could not outwork this one alone. She just didn't know yet who she was willing to call. The envelope arrived on a Saturday morning, slid under her door sometime before she woke up. Claire almost stepped on it on her way to the kitchen. She was running on 5 hours of sleep. She'd been up until 2 reviewing the formal notice from the Office of Academic Integrity that had arrived in her inbox exactly 48 hours after Professor Aldridge's meeting, precise as a threat. The notice outlined the review timeline, the hearing date 6 weeks out, and the specific language about scholarship suspension pending investigation. She had read it 4 times, printed it once, and sat with it on her desk under the garage sale lamp until her eyes stopped processing the words and started just seeing shapes on paper. She almost left the envelope on the floor and made her coffee first. Instead, she picked it up to no return address. Her name and apartment number written in clean, even handwriting on the front. Not printed, not a label, actually written, with a pen that had left slight impressions in the paper. The envelope was heavier than it looked. Cream-colored, the kind that came in a box from a stationery shop rather than a pack of 50 from a drugstore. She stood in her kitchen in her socks and her oversized sleep shirt and turned it over once before opening it. Inside was a business card and a single folded note. The card was black. Not dark gray, not navy matte black, with the name Lee Young-cho embossed in clean silver lettering. Below the name, a phone number. Nothing else. No company name, no title, no website. Just the name and the number, which somehow communicated more authority than a card full of credentials would have. The note was written on the same cream paper as the envelope, folded once. For sentences. I saw what happened at the Meridian building. I own it. I owe you an apology on behalf of my staff. If you need anything, call. And below that, the signature. The same clean, even handwriting as the envelope. Claire read it twice standing in the kitchen. Then she carried both the card and the note to the table and sat down. She thought about the night at the gala, the marble lobby, the elevator, the ride down alone. She had not looked back when she left. She had not let herself. Looking back would have meant acknowledging the audience, and she had decided in the elevator that the audience did not deserve her acknowledgement. She had walked out, taken the L train home, changed into her pajamas, and spent 20 minutes sitting on the edge of her bed doing the specific kind of breathing that isn't quite crying. Then she had set her alarm for 4, turned off the lamp and gone to sleep, because the breakfast shift didn't move for humiliation and neither did she. She had not told anyone about the gala. Not her mother. That conversation would have required explaining why she went and then explaining why she thought she could go. And Claire didn't have the energy for the particular flavor of doubt her mother deployed when Claire reached for something outside the perimeter of what their family had historically been allowed to reach for. Not her classmates. Not anyone. She had absorbed it and moved forward because that was the only direction she knew. And now this. She turned the business card over in her hands. The back was blank. She turned it face up again and looked at the name. Lee Young-cho. She had not heard it before the gala, but she had heard it since Min-jae. She'd overheard someone say at the elevator bank that night, "Tell Mr. Lee the alderman wants 10 minutes before the end of the evening." She had filed it away without meaning to, the way her mind filed everything, and now here it was attached to a name and a phone number and 4 sentences that amounted to the first unsolicited apology anyone had offered her in recent memory. I owe you an apology on behalf of my staff. Not I'm sorry if you were offended. Not there may have been a misunderstanding. Just a direct, clean acknowledgement that something wrong had happened, and that he bore responsibility for it. She recognized the difference because she had been on the receiving end of enough non-apologies to know what an actual one looked like. She thought about calling. She picked up her phone, set it back down. Picked it up again. The problem wasn't the card. The problem was what calling would mean, what it would require her to admit about her situation, about the disciplinary review, about the very specific and escalating way her life was currently coming apart at a seam she hadn't known was loose. Claire Scott did not call strangers for help. Claire Scott did not call anyone for help. That wasn't a personality trait she'd chosen so much as a survival strategy she developed over years of learning that asking for things made you vulnerable to the disappointment of not receiving them. But she also sat for a long time at that kitchen table, turning the card over and over in her hands, and she did not throw it away. She got up eventually. Made her coffee. Ate a piece of toast standing over the sink. Washed her single dish, dried it, put it back in the cabinet. Looked at the card on the table from across the small room. She picked it up and carried it to her desk, where she set it beside the printed disciplinary notice under the garage sale lamp. The 2 documents sitting side by side like a question she wasn't ready to answer yet. Then she opened her laptop, cracked screen and all, and went back to work. She called on a Tuesday morning, between the breakfast rush and the lunch prep, standing outside the diner in the cold with her coat half-zipped and her breath making small clouds in the November air. She had drafted what she was going to say 3 times on the back of a diner order pad the night before. Not a script, she wasn't going to read from anything, but an outline the same way she outlined papers before she wrote them. What had happened? What she needed? What she was not asking for? She had crossed out the last item twice and written it back in both times because it was the most important one and she needed to say it clearly, without softening it or burying it somewhere in the middle where it could be misread as negotiable. He picked up on the second ring. She told him her name, though she suspected he already knew it. He said he was glad she called in a tone that was direct without being warm. Not unfriendly, just economical, the way someone speaks when they've learned that extra words don't usually add anything. She told him she needed to talk about something and asked if he had time. He said he could meet her Thursday at noon. He named a coffee shop in Logan Square. A neighborhood place with mismatched chairs and a counter that smelled like cardamom. Not the Gold Coast. Not anywhere near the Meridian Tower. She noted that without commenting on it and said Thursday was fine. She was there 8 minutes early. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with a black coffee and his phone face down beside the cup. No suit today, dark trousers, a charcoal sweater. The same composed stillness she remembered from across the party. He stood briefly when she came in, which she hadn't expected, and waited until she sat before he did. She ordered a coffee she wasn't sure she could justify spending $3 on and told herself it was the cost of the meeting. Then she laid it out the way she'd outlined it, the seminar paper, the plagiarism complaint, the disciplinary hearing now 4 weeks away, the scholarship suspension language in the formal notice. She did not editorialize. She did not perform distress. She presented it the way she would present a case study in class. Here are the facts, here is what is at stake, here is what the timeline looks like. He listened without interrupting. He didn't nod along in the performative way some people did when they were waiting for their turn to speak. He just listened, his eyes steady on her, his coffee untouched. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What do you need?" Not "what can I do?" Not "let me handle this." Just "what do you need?" with the implicit understanding that the answer was hers to determine. She had prepared for this too. She told him she needed 2 things. A higher education attorney who knew academic disciplinary procedures and time. Because the evidence that would clear her existed. She just needed enough space and support to build the case properly before the hearing date. She had the timestamped drafts on her laptop. She had her work schedule records from the diner that placed her at the counter on the nights she'd written the paper. She had the Wi-Fi login data from the diner's network that would show her device accessing the DePaul submission portal. What she did not have was someone who knew how to shape that evidence into something a review board would be compelled to act on. Lee Young-cho nodded once. He told her he knew someone. A higher education attorney named Marcus Webb, who had spent 12 years doing civil rights work in academic institutions and took cases like hers on a pro bono basis. He said he would make the introduction if she wanted it. Then he said something she hadn't anticipated. That Marcus would work for her, not for him. That the referral was a referral, not a leash. That if she called Marcus and decided after the first meeting that she didn't want to proceed, that was her decision and it had nothing to do with Lee Young-cho. She looked at him across the table for a moment. Then she asked him directly why he was doing this. He was quiet for a beat. Then he told her, in the same economical tone he'd used since she sat down, what he was. Not what he appeared to be on paper. Not the real estate portfolio, not the holding companies, not the charity gala donor list. What he actually was. The organization he ran. The way power moved through it. The things that made him useful and the things that made him dangerous, and the fact that those 2 categories overlapped almost entirely. He didn't apologize for it. Didn't frame it as a past he'd moved beyond. He said it plainly, the way someone speaks when they've decided that honesty is more efficient than management. Claire listened. When he finished, she told him, just as plainly, that she didn't trade favors. That she wasn't going to owe him something she hadn't agreed to. That if accepting Marcus's help meant she was building a debt to Lee Young-cho, she'd rather lose the scholarship and figure something else out. She meant it. He could hear that she meant it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone recalibrating a calculation they thought they'd already finished. Then he nodded once, the same way he'd nodded when she told him what she needed. Like it was exactly what he'd expected her to say. He picked up his coffee for the first time since she'd arrived, took a drink and set it back down. Then he wrote Marcus's number on a napkin and slid it across the table. No conditions attached. No follow-up ask. Just the number, the name, and the quiet that meant the terms had been set and he was fine with them. Marcus Webb worked out of a small office in Pilsen, second floor of a building that also housed a tax preparation service and a community health clinic. His desk was buried under accordion folders and color-tab binders and stacks of printed case law that looked like they'd been read multiple times and argued with in the margins. He was in his mid-40s, black, with reading glasses he took on and off constantly while he talked, and the specific kind of focused energy that came from someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had not yet decided to stop. He met with Claire the day after she called. He listened to the full situation without taking notes, then took notes for 40 minutes straight. At the end of the first meeting, he told her the case was winnable and the evidence she'd described, if they could document it properly, was exactly the kind of concrete digital trail that review boards couldn't dismiss without exposing their own process to challenge. He told her what he needed from her and gave her a list. Then he told her it was going to require 6 weeks of consistent work on her part, because he could shape the argument but she was the only one who could build the foundation of it. Claire took the list home and started that night. The next 6 weeks ran on a schedule that left almost no margin for anything that wasn't essential. Diner shift, class, evidence documentation, sleep, repeat. She pulled every draft of the paper from her laptop's version history, 11 saved iterations with timestamps running from 8:47 on a Monday evening to 11:39 on the Tuesday she submitted. She exported the metadata and emailed it to Marcus, who had it verified by a digital forensics contact he used for exactly this kind of case. She went to the diner's manager, a tired but fair woman named Gloria who had known Claire for 2 years, and asked for printed copies of her shift records for the relevant weeks. Gloria handed them over without asking why, and told her to let her know if she needed anything else. Claire thanked her and meant it. She pulled the diner's Wi-Fi access logs through the router admin panel that Gloria gave her the password to, isolating the records that showed her laptop's device ID connecting to the DePaul submission portal at 11:39 on a Tuesday, the same timestamp as the final draft, the same night, the same device, from an IP address registered to a diner on the West Loop that was not Priya's neighborhood, not Priya's Wi-Fi, not anywhere Priya could plausibly claim the work had originated from. Marcus reviewed it and said it was good. Then he said, "Get me the purchase receipts for the coffee you bought those nights if you still have them, because detail compounds." Claire went back through her banking app and found 4 separate $2.70 charges from the diner's own register on the evening she'd worked late. She forwarded the screenshots without comment. She did all of this between the breakfast shift and the dinner prep and the Tuesday through Thursday seminar she still had to attend, where she sat 2 rows behind Priya and kept her expression neutral and her work clean. She did not speak to Priya beyond what the class structure required. She did not give her anything to read. Her mother called on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week, while Claire was at her kitchen table cross-referencing her source citations against the plagiarism complaints claims, a task that required enough concentration that she almost let it go to voicemail. She answered because she always answered, because the habit of it was older than her ability to examine it. Her mother asked how school was going. Claire said fine. Her mother said she'd heard from her aunt that Claire was having some kind of trouble with a class, and before Claire could ask how that information had traveled, her mother was already in the middle of a thought she'd clearly been developing for some time, about how maybe DePaul was a lot of pressure, about how nursing was hard and competitive, about how not everyone was built for that kind of environment and there was no shame in reassessing. She said it gently, in the careful voice she used when she wanted something to land softly that was going to land hard regardless. She said, "I just don't want you to burn yourself out reaching for something that keeps moving." Claire listened. She held the phone against her ear and looked at the evidence binder on her table, the printed shift records, the timestamp drafts, the Wi-Fi logs, the 4 coffee receipts that Marcus had called compelling detail. She thought about the paper she had written on a cracked laptop at a diner counter at 11:40 on a Tuesday because that was the only time she had. She thought about the alarm at 4 in the morning and the bus and the 11 minutes to get out the door and every calculation she had made for years to keep the structure of her life standing. She said, "I hear you, Mom." And she meant that she heard it, not that she agreed with it, not that it was landing the way her mother intended, but that she could identify what it was and set it down separately from herself. Her mother's doubt had always felt like whether she was supposed to dress for She understood, sitting at that table, that it wasn't hers to carry. It belonged to her mother. Born from fear. Shaped by a life that had taught her that wanting too much was the fastest way to lose everything. Claire understood where it came from. She just wasn't going to let it live in her anymore. She said she had to get back to work. She said goodnight. She hung up and did not block the number because her mother was still her mother, but she sat for a moment in the quiet of her apartment and felt something shift. Not break, not harden, just settle into a different position, like a weight she'd been holding in one hand finally moved to the floor where it belonged. Her phone buzzed 10 minutes later. A text from Lee Young-cho. How's the case going? Do you need anything? No question mark. Just the words, clean and direct, the same way he'd texted every week for 6 weeks without variation. Not thinking of you. Not just checking in. Just the 2 questions that mattered, delivered without performance. She typed back. Evidence is almost complete. Hearing in 2 weeks. I'm ready. 3 dots. Then good. That was it. That was always it. And somehow that was exactly enough. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning on a Thursday in December. Claire was up at 4 out of habit, not nerves, though the two felt similar enough that she didn't spend time distinguishing between them. She showered, dressed in the dark navy blazer she'd bought secondhand from a consignment shop in Wicker Park 3 years ago for a clinical presentation. The one piece of clothing she owned that said, "I am not here to be dismissed," without saying anything at all. She pulled her braids back, pressed her lips together in the bathroom mirror, and looked at herself for a moment the same way she had in the gas station bathroom 6 weeks before the gala. The difference was that this time she knew exactly what she was walking into, and she had spent 6 weeks making sure she was ready for it. She ate toast. She drank coffee. She picked up the evidence binder from the desk beside the garage sale lamp, the one that had been sitting there for 6 weeks next to Lee Young-cho's business card and the printed disciplinary notice, all 3 of them occupying the same small square of desk space like a document of the last 2 months of her life. She put the card in her blazer pocket without thinking too hard about why, and left the apartment at 7:15. Marcus was waiting outside the Office of Academic Integrity on the 4th floor of the administration building when she arrived. He had his own binder, thicker than hers, and the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had walked into rooms like this many times and had stopped being impressed by their architecture. He asked her once if she was ready. She said yes. He nodded and said almost nothing else, because they had agreed in their last meeting that Claire would present the evidence herself. Not because Marcus couldn't do it better technically, but because Claire had asked him to let her speak. She had built this case. She knew every document in the binder in the specific way you know something you assembled by hand, and she wanted the board to hear it from the person it had actually happened to. The review board was 3 people: the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, the chair of the nursing department, and a faculty representative from the university's Academic Integrity Committee. They sat on one side of a long conference table. Claire and Marcus sat on the other. Priya was not present, but her attorney was, a woman in her 30s in a gray suit who had the polished, preemptive calm of someone who had decided before entering the room that this was a manageable situation. The Associate Dean opened the session, outlined the process, and invited Claire to respond to the complaint. Claire opened her binder. She started with the timeline. Not an argument, not a narrative, just dates. The date the paper was assigned. The dates she'd worked the diner shifts during which she'd written it. The date of each saved draft. Pulled from her laptop's version history and verified by a digital forensics specialist, whose credentials she submitted as a supporting document. She placed the printed version history on the table and walked the board through each timestamp without editorializing. Because the timestamps didn't need her help. They said what they said. Then she submitted the Wi-Fi access logs. Her device ID, the diner's registered IP address, the DePaul submission portal access recorded at 11:39 on a Tuesday evening. She explained what each column meant in the log format, because she had anticipated that not everyone on the board would read network data regularly, and she had prepared a 1-page plain language summary. She placed that on the table too. Then the shift records from Gloria, printed on diner letterhead, showing Claire's clock-in and clock-out times on each of the 4 evenings she'd worked late and written. Then the 4 coffee receipts from the diner's own register, time-stamped, cross-referenced to the shift records and the draft history. Detail compounds, Marcus had said. She had believed him. Priya's attorney waited until Claire finished, and then described the complaint as a matter of structural similarity that may have resulted from shared source material and overlapping research approaches. A misunderstanding between two students working in the same academic space, not an intentional act on either side. Claire responded without raising her voice. She noted the date the plagiarism complaint was filed and cross-referenced it against the date of the grade return for the second paper, placing the two documents side by side on the table. She noted that the sources cited in the complaint as the basis for the similarity claim were sources she had never accessed, a fact supported by her browser history and research log, both of which she submitted. She noted that the paper had been written at a diner on the West Loop on a device registered to her, on a network registered to the diner, at timestamps that preceded the complaint by 10 days. She said she was happy to answer questions about any document in the binder. The board asked 4 questions. Claire answered each one with a document. Priya's attorney said nothing further. The board deliberated for 4 hours. Claire and Marcus waited in the hallway on a bench outside the office. Marcus drank coffee from a paper cup. Claire read a pharmacology chapter on her phone because the hearing was on a Thursday and she had an exam on Friday, and the exam didn't move for disciplinary hearings any more than the breakfast shift moved for humiliation. The associate dean came into the hallway at 2:17 in the afternoon and told Claire the complaint had been dismissed in full. The finding was that the evidence did not support the allegation. Priya would be placed on academic probation for filing a complaint determined to be without sufficient basis. Claire's scholarship status would be restored and the record of the complaint removed from her file. She thanked him. She shook Marcus's hand in the hallway and told him she meant it. He said she'd done the work herself and to call him if she ever needed anything again. Then she took the elevator down and walked out of the building into the cold Chicago wind, December sharp and indifferent, and stood on the front steps with her binder under her arm and the city moving past her at its usual speed. She did not cry. Not because she wasn't feeling it. She was feeling all of it, the 6 weeks and the 4 a.m. alarms and the gas station bathroom and the diner counter at 11:40, and every moment she had held the whole thing together through sheer refusal to let it fall apart. She felt every bit of it pressing against the inside of her chest. But she had spent so long preparing for this fight that winning felt less like an arrival and more like the first full breath after a long time of breathing carefully. Not relief exactly, just the quiet return of something that should have been there all along. She stood on the steps for 60 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and texted Lee Young-cho 2 words. It's done. She didn't call until 9 o'clock. Not because she was avoiding it. She had decided on the steps of the administration building that she was going to make this call, and she was not someone who unmade decisions once they were set. But she wanted to do it from home, in her own space, with enough quiet around her that she could say what she needed to say without the city in the background making it feel like something other than what it was. So she took the L train back to the south side, stopped at the corner store for a can of soup she heated on the stove, ate it standing at the counter, washed the pot, dried it, put it away. She changed out of the navy blazer and hung it carefully on the hook behind the door. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a few minutes, not thinking exactly, just letting the day settle into its actual shape. Then she called her mother. Her mother picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the slight wariness it always had when Claire called outside of the first of the month schedule, a low-level alertness, like she was already calculating what the call might cost her. Claire heard it and recognized it and set it aside. She told her mother the hearing had gone well, that the complaint had been dismissed, that her scholarship was restored and the record was being cleared. She said it factually, the way she'd said everything today, because the facts were enough without decoration. Her mother said that was good, baby, that's good, and there was genuine relief in it, the kind that confirmed she had known something was wrong even if she hadn't asked directly. Then she started to say something about how maybe now Claire could take a breath. Maybe ease up a little on the pace she kept, and Claire said, "Mom," gently, but with enough weight that her mother stopped. She had not prepared this the way she'd prepared the hearing. She didn't have a binder for it, no time-stamped evidence, no plain language summary. She just had the truth, which she had been carrying for long enough that it had worn a groove in her, and she knew its shape exactly. She told her mother that she loved her. She said it first, deliberately, because she needed it to be the foundation of everything that followed and not something that had to be inferred from the wreckage of a hard conversation. Then she said that she could not keep absorbing doubt dressed as concern, that when her mother called to suggest she was reaching too far, or that maybe nursing school wasn't the right environment, or that reassessing was nothing to be ashamed of. It didn't feel like protection. It felt like a hand on her arm walking her toward a door she hadn't chosen. Her mother started to say something. Claire let her start and then kept going, not loudly, not with the accumulated anger of years finally finding an exit, just steadily, because steadiness was the only register she trusted herself in right now. She said she had been holding both of them up for a long time. The monthly transfers, the overdue bills, the $200 by Friday, the yes I'll see what I can do that she'd said so many times it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like gravity. She said she was going to keep doing her part because that was who she was and she wasn't asking to be released from it. But she was going to keep building her life at the same time, and the two things were going to coexist whether or not anyone around her was comfortable with that. She was not going to make herself smaller to make her ambition less alarming to the people who loved her. Then she said the thing she had never said directly in 22 years. That she needed her mother to decide. Not today, not right now, but at some point. Whether she wanted to be part of what Claire was building or whether she was going to keep standing at the edge of it telling Claire the structure looked unstable. That both were choices. That only one of them was something Claire could keep walking toward. She stopped talking. The silence on the other end was long enough that she checked once to make sure the call hadn't dropped. It hadn't. She could hear her mother breathing, the faint sound of the television in the background that her mother kept on low every evening, the small familiar texture of the house on the south side that Claire had grown up in and left at 18 and sent money back to ever since. When her mother finally spoke, her voice was different. Not broken, her mother did not break easily, which was a thing they had in common, but stripped of the careful gentleness she usually deployed, the softening that sometimes made it hard to find the truth underneath. What came out instead was something unguarded and plainly said, the way people speak when they've stopped managing how they sound. I don't know how to be proud of someone I'm scared of losing. Claire sat very still. It was not an apology. It did not undo the Wednesday evening phone call or the years of first-of-the-month calculations or the particular way her mother's doubt had always arrived wrapped in the language of love. It was not a transformation. Her mother was not a different person on the other side of that sentence. But it was the first true thing, unmanaged, undecorated, just the actual feeling underneath all the other feelings, that her mother had ever said to her directly. And Claire understood it, not because it excused anything but because she recognized the shape of it. The fear of watching someone you love move into a life you can't follow them into. The pride that looks like worry because worry is the only language available. She said, I know, Mom. And she meant it. They stayed on the line for another minute without saying much. Then her mother said goodnight and Claire said goodnight and the call ended. Claire sat in the dark of her apartment for a long time after, the garage sale lamp off, the city doing its quiet nighttime work outside the window. She didn't replay the conversation or grade it or decide what it meant for every conversation that would come after. She just sat with it, the one true thing her mother had said, small and unpolished and real, and let it be enough for tonight. 1 year after the gala, Claire Scott passed her nursing boards on the first attempt. She found out on a Thursday morning, sitting in her apartment at the kitchen table with her laptop open and her coffee going cold beside it, the same way she'd found out most things that mattered, alone in the quiet, without ceremony. The results loaded in the licensing portal at 7:43, and she sat with them for a full minute before they became real. Pass. 1 word, 2 syllables, the end of a process that had taken 2 years of clinicals and 6 weeks of board prep added on to 4 years of everything else. She closed the laptop, opened it again, read the word a second time. Then she got up and washed her coffee cup, because her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. Northwestern Memorial called 2 weeks later. She had applied in October before the board results. The way you apply for things when you've decided that preparation and outcome are 2 separate responsibilities and yours is only the first one. The nurse recruiter told her the ER unit had a position, days and rotating evenings, starting salary $61,000. She did the math before she hung up. Rent, loans, utilities, the monthly transfer to her mother's account. It covered everything and left $400 that belonged to no one but her. She signed the offer letter the same day. The first thing she did after sending it back was open a savings account. Not a plan to open one, not a mental note. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and opened it, transferred $200 from her checking account as the initial deposit, and looked at the balance for longer than was strictly necessary. $200. Her name. An account that existed for no reason except the future. The second thing she did was sign a new lease. Her studio in the South Side had served its purpose, But the lease was month to month and the landlord still hadn't fixed the overhead light, which had been out for 14 months. She found a one-bedroom in Andersonville, 3rd floor, windows facing east, overhead light that worked. She signed the lease herself, with her own income listed on the application. No cosigner, no explanation required. She moved in on a Saturday with 2 carloads of things that fit easily because she had spent years owning only what she could carry. She hung her Northwestern badge on the hook by the front door the evening before her first shift, the way you hang something you've earned in a place where you'll see it every morning. She stood in the kitchen afterward in the quiet of the new apartment and looked at the badge from across the room. Her name. The Northwestern Memorial logo. The word that came after her name on the lanyard. RN. Her mother called on a Tuesday in February. Not the first of the month. Not because anything was overdue. Claire saw the name on the screen and let it ring once out of old habit before she answered. Her mother said she'd seen a segment on the local news about nursing shortages in Chicago hospitals. About how hard the work was, how much it mattered, how the people doing it showed up every day for other people at the worst moments of their lives. She said she'd watched the whole thing. She said she'd thought about Claire the entire time. She didn't say "I'm proud of you" in those words, but she said "I thought about you" in a way that carried the same weight, imprecise and honest, which was the only language her mother had ever fully spoken. Claire said she was glad she called. She meant it. The Korean restaurant in Andersonville was small and family-owned, the kind of place with handwritten specials on a chalkboard and an owner who refilled your water without being asked. Lee Young-cho had suggested it the way he suggested most things, directly, without making it a question. She'd been to his world by then, or the edges of it she was permitted to see, and she'd learned to read the difference between the version of him that moved through power and the version that sat across a small table in a neighborhood restaurant and ordered for both of them in Korean because he knew the menu and she'd told him she trusted his judgment on this specific thing. They were halfway through dinner when he set down his chopsticks and told her, in the same tone he'd used the first time, in the Logan Square coffee shop, that he was still not a good man. That the organization he ran was still what it was. That the things that made him dangerous a year ago were the same things that made him dangerous now, and he wasn't going to dress that differently than he had the first time he'd said it. Claire looked at him across the table. She told him she was still learning to let people stand beside her without looking for the exit. That some mornings she woke up and the old instinct was still there. The one that said depending on anyone was just a debt she hadn't been billed for yet. That she was working on it the same way she worked on everything, methodically and without pretending it was finished before it was. He nodded. Then he said, "No rescuing, no fixing," she said. "Just this." They both understood what this was. Not a definition, not a category, not a promise calibrated to sound better than it could deliver. Just 2 people who had looked at each other clearly, without the softening that makes things easier to accept and harder to trust, and chosen to stay in the room anyway. Knowing the cost. Paying it consciously, she drove home after dinner through Andersonville streets that were already starting to feel familiar. The corner store, the dry cleaner, the coffee shop she'd been to twice. She parked, walked up the 3 flights, unlocked the door. The apartment was dark except for the light she'd left on in the kitchen, the overhead one that worked, casting its clean, reliable light across the counter and the table, and the savings account number she'd written on a post-it and stuck to the refrigerator for no reason except that she wanted to see it. She hung her keys on the hook beside the Northwestern badge. Stood in the kitchen in her coat for a moment, the way she sometimes did when she needed to feel the room around her before she moved through it. The life in this apartment was entirely hers. Not borrowed from someone else's expectations. Not performed for an audience that had never been paying attention anyway. Not held together with apology and sacrifice and the quiet erosion of wanting things she'd been told were too far. Just hers, the badge, the lease, the savings account, the overhead light, the east-facing windows, the $400 that belonged to no one else. She took off her coat and hung it up. She was exactly enough to fill it.